In the summer of 1869, on a dirt road in the foothills of California's gold country, a group of travelers appeared that no one in the region had ever seen before. They were Japanese. Some had been samurai. A few still carried swords, though the era that had given those swords meaning was already ending behind them on the other side of the Pacific. They had not come to mine gold. They had come to build a farm. Behind them lay a war they had lost, a homeland reorganizing itself into something unrecognizable, and a decision that many of their neighbors back in Japan would never have made: to leave and try to begin again in a country most of them had never seen. Few people who watched them pass that day could have guessed what they were carrying with them: tea seeds, mulberry saplings, bamboo shoots wrapped in damp cloth. The beginnings of a settlement unlike anything California had known before, and one that would not survive to see its third year. To understand why they came, it helps to understand what they had lost. In 1868, Japan was tearing itself apart. A coalition of domains, acting in the name of the young Meiji Emperor, moved to end centuries of rule by the Tokugawa shogunate. Not every domain accepted the change peacefully. Aizu, in Japan's northeast, resisted. The fighting that followed, known as the Boshin War, turned against Aizu badly. Its castle town, Aizu Wakamatsu, was besieged and shelled. The domain's forces, including famously young defenders, were defeated. When the fighting ended, Aizu's samurai class had lost its domain, its status, and in many cases, its livelihood. For the men and women who had served Aizu, the world they had known was gone. Some faced exile within Japan itself, relocated to poorer, harsher domains as a condition of surrender. For a smaller number, a more radical option took shape: leaving Japan entirely. The man most responsible for that option was John Henry Schnell, a German merchant and arms dealer who had spent years in Japan and had grown close to the Aizu domain, reportedly serving it as a military advisor during the war. Exactly how deep Schnell's ties to Aizu ran and what his full motivations were is not entirely settled by the historical record. What is documented is that Schnell married into a Japanese family, was granted samurai status by Aizu, and after the domain's defeat, organized a plan to bring a group of former Aizu retainers and their families to California to start a new life through agriculture. Schnell secured land in the Sierra foothills, near Gold Hill in El Dorado County, and began arranging the voyage. He would lead the venture, acting as the bridge between his Japanese partners and the American world they were entering, a role that placed enormous responsibility and enormous risk on one man's judgment. In the spring of 1869, roughly 20 to 22 settlers, sources vary slightly, departed Japan under Schnell's direction. They carried with them tea plants, mulberry trees for silk cultivation, bamboo, and other crops selected for California's climate, along with tools and whatever possessions a life beginning over could hold. They arrived in San Francisco that May, only months after Japan's civil war had ended, and only a year after the Meiji government had begun formally restricting emigration of former samurai. Their timing placed them among the very first organized groups of Japanese immigrants to settle permanently in the United States. To the Americans who encountered them, the group's arrival was almost impossible to categorize. They were not laborers recruited for a known industry. They were not diplomats. They were something California newspapers of the era struggled to describe. Former warriors turned farmers, attempting to plant a piece of Japan in the American West. The land Schnell purchased sat in the rolling hills near Gold Hill, not far from Placerville, in country already reshaped by the gold rush 2 decades earlier. The settlers named their venture the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony, after the castle town most of them had left behind. Their plan was ambitious and, on paper, well suited to the region. California's climate offered warm, dry summers that seemed promising for tea cultivation, and the group planted thousands of mulberry trees to feed silkworms for silk production. They added bamboo, along with other crops carried from Japan, hoping to build not just a farm, but a demonstration of what Japanese agricultural knowledge could accomplish on American soil. It was the first attempt of its kind in the United States. Whatever happened next, the Wakamatsu Colony would become California's only tea and silk farm colony, and one of the earliest lasting Japanese settlements in North America. For a brief period, the colony showed real promise. The settlers worked to adapt techniques developed over generations in Japan to unfamiliar soil, unfamiliar water patterns, and an unfamiliar market. Neighboring American settlers, curious about their new arrivals, took note of the disciplined, careful way the colonists worked their land. Samples of the colony's tea and silk products were exhibited publicly, appearing at regional agricultural and horticultural exhibitions, where they drew interest as a novelty, and for a moment, as a genuine sign that the venture might succeed. For the settlers, each surviving mulberry tree and each tea plant that took root represented more than agriculture. It represented proof that a new life, however improbable its beginnings, might actually hold. But successful demonstration crops are not the same as a self-sustaining farm. The colony needed years to mature its plantings, steady capital to bridge that gap, and reliable water in a region prone to dry summers. It had none of these in abundance. California's climate, generous in some years, turned harsh in others. Drought struck the region not long after the colony was established, straining crops that had not yet had time to root deeply or prove their long-term viability. Financial pressure mounted alongside the weather. The colony had been funded largely through Schnell's own resources and arrangements, and those resources were not unlimited. Within roughly a year of the colony's founding, Schnell left the settlement, traveling to San Francisco and reportedly intending to seek further funding, possibly from Japan. He did not return. What became of him afterward is not reliably documented, and this account will not speculate beyond what the historical record supports. What is clear is that his departure left the remaining settlers without the funding and organizational leadership the venture depended on at the worst possible moment. Without capital, without rain, and without the man who had organized their journey, the colony's fortunes collapsed quickly. By 1871, less than 2 years after it began, the Wakamatsu tea and silk farm colony had effectively dissolved. Among the colonists was a young woman named Okei Ito, believed to have worked in the household of the Veerkamp family, who purchased the colony's land after its collapse and allowed some of the remaining Japanese settlers to stay on. Okei died in 1871, still a teenager, not long after the colony's failure. She was buried on a hillside on the property, and her grave remains there today, marked and maintained, one of the very few physical traces of the colony that survives largely intact. Details of her life before and during the colony are limited, and this account will not fill those gaps with invention. What can be said is that her grave became, over time, one of the most enduring symbols of the settlement's brief existence and of the young life it asked her to build so far from home. The colony's remaining settlers dispersed after its collapse. Some returned to Japan. Others, evidence suggests, remained in California or moved elsewhere in the United States, though their individual paths afterward are not consistently documented. The Wakamatsu venture was never repeated at the same scale, and no comparable colony followed it. What had been, for a short time, a working demonstration of Japanese agricultural settlement in America quietly came apart, its members scattering into lives the historical record only partly preserves. Where certainty ends, this account will not claim more than the evidence allows. Today, portions of the original Wakamatsu farm still stand near Gold Hill, preserved as a historic site. The farmhouse remains. So does the oak tree above Okei Ito's grave. What happened there between 1869 and 1871 was brief, and by most measures, it failed. But it marked something that outlasted its own collapse. one of the first sustained encounters between Japanese immigrants and American soil, attempted not by soldiers or diplomats, but by a small group of displaced people trying, with whatever knowledge and hope they had left, to grow something that might outlast the world that had been taken from them. Little of what they planted survived. Almost no one, at the time, thought to record their names. But the ground remembers what the history books nearly didn't.